Alito, and welcome to Native ChocTalk, a podcast by natives for all. Here, we're keeping our native ancestors' stories and history alive while also sharing with you our native cultures, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And stay tuned for the end of each episode where we'll talk about some great ways to support Native causes and or Native-owned businesses. Let's get started.
Potential is everywhere in the Choctaw people. It's in our schools and students. It's in our small businesses and entrepreneurs. Potential is in our lifestyle and health. It's in our culture and heritage. Passion and commitment is in our blood. Ingenuity and economy are a tradition. And the Choctaw Foundation was founded for this potential. To cultivate minds and hearts, to stimulate ideas and passions, to extend lives and improve health through education, and to preserve and promote the power of our past. The Choctaw Foundation, meeting the potential of the Choctaw people.
I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive. These are the words spoken on the deathbed of probably the most well-known Native American warrior in history. But what about that so-called history? Sometimes the tales of notorious Indians were just that, tales, or their stories were written by authors who sensationalized the facts. Thankfully, historians are coming out with more information these days, and although we may never know the whole story, we do know a little more than we did yesterday. Growing up, many natives I knew didn't like the idea of Geronimo. They considered him a sellout, making money from the same people who took their people captive, while others saw him as a great warrior and someone who knew how to make the most of his situation. After hearing my guests' research and also doing some searching on my own, Geronimo really comes to life for me in a whole new way. Listeners, I hope you'll appreciate and take notes of the history and story of this warrior and how he was right smack dab in a pivotal and difficult moment in American Indian history. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. W. Michael Farmer, coming to us straight from Virginia. How's everything out your way, Michael?
Hello, everybody. Everything's fine here. It's just hotter than blue blazes and very humid.
Yes, it's definitely summer, so we thought maybe this is a good time to be inside recording, right?
Absolutely.
Now, before we get to know Geronimo a little more, I'd like to highlight some of your own story. So here goes. W. Michael Farmer is a retired PhD physicist. His scientific research included measurement of atmospheric aerosols with laser-based instruments, and he has published a 2-volume reference book on atmospheric effects on remote sensing. Michael also combines 10 plus years of research into 19th century Apache history and culture with Southwest living experience to fill his stories with a genuine sense of time and place. He has also written short stories for anthologies and award-winning essays. His first novel, Hombrecitos War, won a Western Writers of America Spur Finalist Award for Best First Novel in 2006 and was a New Mexico Book Award finalist for historical fiction in 2007. In addition, his book, Killer of Witches, The Life and Times of Yellow Boy, Mescalero Apache, Book 1, won a Will Rogers Medallion Award and was a New Mexico, Arizona Book Awards finalist in 2016. There are many more awards to mention, but let's kick off here into learning more about Geronimo, the warrior. What inspired you to write about Geronimo?
He was the bad guy when I was a kid growing up in all the movies. You know, when the actors who were invariably cowboys or cavalry spoke his name, it was always loaded with ominous foreboding. And you know, when I grew up and kind of forgot about Indians for a while, trying to make a living. I kind of forgot about him, but
well, you were kind of being a physicist and stuff,
yeah,
I was
right,
pretty impressed by your
right,
background, by the way.
yeah.
Yeah, so go ahead.
But when I started writing, he wound up being a minor character in my second novel, and I did a little bit of research on him for the novel, and I realized that after he surrendered, most folks knew little or nothing about what happened to him and the Chiricahuas. And I learned it was a remarkable story, and its events were great fuel for a novel. And so I started writing about him.
Well, I'm glad you did, because again, I had no idea the details of this. And like you said, we all grew up watching some of those movies back in the day, the Westerns. I grew up watching those with my dad a lot. Some were black and white, some were color. And there's really, as we all know now, such a misconception that was brought about from Hollywood in those movies. And hopefully we're starting to right some of those misconceptions now. But there could possibly be some folks out there who haven't heard of Geronimo. So I'll give a quick overview here. From history.com in 2019, I quote, Geronimo, 1829 to 1909, was an Apache leader and medicine man best known for his fearlessness in resisting anyone, Mexican or American, who attempted to remove his people from their tribal lands. He repeatedly evaded capture and life on his reservation, and during his final escape, a full quarter of the U.S. Standing Army pursued him and his followers. Well, let's start with Geronimo's early life. Where was he born and in what year?
He was born in the upper Gila River country, which includes a part of western New Mexico. And there's some debate exactly whether he was on the west side of the New Mexico-Arizona border or on the east side. Mm-hmm. It really probably doesn't make a lot of difference. The books, like his autobiography, say that he was born in 1829. But Angie Debo, who wrote what was considered the definitive biography, says that it was more likely that he was born in 1823. Their place of birth was important to Apaches, and as children they were often taken to their birthplace to roll on the ground in the four directions to prove the place of their birth. And when you see months of birth, much less days, it's pure supposition, and the year is a best guess. Barrett, his autobiographer, tried to organize the events in Geronimo's life according to the Anglo calendar. Normally, a season in Geronimo's case, the season of many leaves, late spring, early summer, and a major event in the year was about as close as they kept a birth date. Angie Debo, as I said, believed that the year that he was born is most likely 1823, because he grew up with and was about the same age as Jason Betsin's mother, who remembered Halley's Comet and the night the stars fell. So
wow, interesting.
Yeah.
And like you said, I have relatives too, that my own great grandmother, all our lives, we always knew her to have two birthday months in the same year every year, because she didn't know when her birthday was. So even as soon as that. So tell us about the Chiricahua Apache and about the four sub bands of the Chiricahua.
Okay, as you say, there were four bands. Geronimo began life as a Bedonkohe. They were located in eastern central Arizona and western central New Mexico, and they eventually merged with other bands. Then there were the Chokonan Chiricahuas, who were the band of Cochise and his son, and they were located in southeastern Arizona. The Kahini, also known as the Membranos or Warm Springs Apaches, were the band of Mangus Coloradus, and he was, the books say that he was probably the greatest unifying leader that the Apaches ever had. Famous Kahinis included Victorio, Nane, and Loco, and they were located primarily in the Membrano Mountains, also known as the Black Range of western New Mexico. And then you have the real bad boys of the Apaches, the Nidni, who were located primarily in the mountains of northern Sonora and Chihuahua in Mexico. And they were the band of Huo, which is how I choose to pronounce it. It's J-U-H, but few people disagree on the pronunciation. So that's what I'm going to use.
Where were the Apache living overall, and then where were the Chiricahua Apache living?
Okay, think of the land spread in three parts. First, the western Apaches, who were the Coyoteros, the Tontos, the Arivapai, and there's some debate over whether the Yavapai were actually Apaches, but that's what the settlers and the soldiers called the Mojave Apaches, or the Yuman Indians. Although they didn't speak the same basic language as the rest of the people, and they lived west of Tucson. Then the Chiricahuas lived east of Tucson and included the four that I've mentioned already, and they ranged from mid-eastern Arizona into Chihuahua and Sonora. The Kahinis lived east of the Arizona and New Mexico line over to the Rio Grande in central New Mexico. And the eastern Apaches, the Jicarilla, the Mescalero, and the Lipans, lived between the Pecos and the Rio Grande rivers.
Okay. Wow. So, I mean, I think it's so easy to just say Apache and not really take into consideration that there were so many bands, there were different sects of where they were living, and we can't just say, oh, they were all in Arizona, which is what we tend to try to do, is to simplify and make it easy. But this is really good information for all of us to soak in. Let's talk about Geronimo's name and what it means.
Well, his Apache name, and there's some debate about this, was Goyactla, which nearly everyone interprets to mean one who yawns. But they're the Apaches who live in Arizona claim that his name was actually Goyale, and that means intelligent, shrewd, and clever. And I don't know if you can determine that from a baby's actions, and I actually think that you probably can. Then that's probably what his name actually was. And then, of course, you have the term Geronimo, and I've had some arguments with folks about whether you should use the Mexican and Spanish nicknames for the Apaches, but actually the Apaches were proud of those because it meant that they were fierce enough that they stood out from the rest and would be recognized by their natural enemies.
Yeah, it's like, oh, we've been noted by these folks, our enemies. So, wow. So remember when we were kids and we were little and we used to jump off a high area and we'd yell Geronimo. Do you remember that? Did you
Oh
do
yeah.
that? Okay. Well, it
I
was
ruined many an umbrella using that for a parachute and yelling that,
we thought we were amazing.
you know.
And it's funny the things that you do when you're little like that and you have no idea where it even came from. Where did that come from?
The tale that I get is that just before the invasion of Normandy, the paratroopers watched a movie that had Geronimo in it, and he was a real baddie in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And when they started bailing out, he just yelled Geronimo, that he was going to be a real baddie for the Germans too, and that's what everybody else started using.
Wow. Again, I would have never thought that's where that even came from. Wow. Well, now Geronimo was a natural born hunter, correct?
Yeah, and I think you can say that about just about all of the Apaches. He had some were much better than others, and he would certainly fall into the top tier. He had good instincts for hunting, but like all Apache children, he was taught how to hunt the large animals like deer, and he learned to hunt the smaller ones like ground squirrels as a child by trial and error.
Yeah, and that's not to discredit when I say natural born hunter. It's not to take away from the fact that he probably really honed his skills over the years and worked hard at that, I'm assuming. Right. But some people do have a little extra gift in there too. Sounds like he had both. So the Apache were great warriors. They were known for their raids. And then Geronimo was really, truly a champion at these raids from what I understand, right?
Yeah, he had been on 4 raids by the time he was 17. Now he didn't lead those raids by age 17. The Apache custom for training warriors was that they served as novitiates, supporting the warriors by doing camp grunt work and cooking, taking care of the horses and other livestock, staying out of the way and watching how the warriors operated. And if they did well at that, then after 4 raids, the warriors might accept a novitiate as a warrior. And when you look at that style, that's remarkably similar to the way they did things in the Middle Ages, where knights had squires.
Yeah.
And the warriors, the new warriors, i.e., when Geronimo became 17, they were expected to lead a raid where they might take enough booty to establish enough personal wealth to take a wife. Geronimo became a respected warrior and a powerful shaman, what they call a Dayan, because he was brilliant tactically, and it had, so it appears, power with a capital P, which I use in my writings as supernatural power.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting. It's like warrior and training type stuff, being able to watch what the seasoned warriors did and learn from them, a pretty remarkable way to learn how to do these raids yourself. So who were they typically raiding against?
They raided anyone who was not a friend or part of the family.
Okay.
And there was a big difference between raiding for supplies, and it was very rare for them to kill anyone during a supply raid, because they wanted that person to prosper so they could come back and steal from him again. And then there are war raids, which were usually for revenge or survival, and they killed anybody they came across.
Wow. And I think something that's interesting is how the Apache were constantly also surrounded by forces who were against them. The Mexicans in the south, the surrounding Navajo, and the Comanches. Also, Comanches were great warriors as well. And then the government to the north. And then when it came to raiding the Mexicans, the government decided to fight back, correct?
Yeah, in terms of actual fighting, the Mexicans were fearful, and they resisted going after the Apaches in the mountains. The Apaches didn't think much of the Mexicans as fighting men, with a few notable exceptions. Besides offering a scalp bounty, the Mexicans often tried to get the Apaches drunk at peace talks, and when they got so drunk they couldn't stand, then they would slaughter them.
Oh, wow.
And that happened a few times with the people that Woe led, but after a while he got smart and wouldn't let more than about half of his people go in to have a drink, and the rest of them stayed outside. So the Mexicans knew that if they killed anybody, they could expect some severe retribution.
Wow. But that, that didn't stop Geronimo and the Apache, though, did it? I mean, this bounty on the scalps and the Mexican government saying they're going to come after them and all that, right?
Oh no, when Geronimo returned to San Carlos in the winter of 1884, he told the agent, who was Captain Emmett Crawford, that his women could beat the Mexican military just by throwing stones at them, and the real Apache mode of operations was ambush.
Wow. So tell us more about that encounter with the Mexicans.
The way the Apaches fought Mexicans depended on place and time. When Geronimo and Victorio were young men, they led big raids for Mangus Coloradus into Mexico, and it was usually with large groups, 50 to 100 men, and they rarely fought the Mexicans head on. The Chiricahuas often raided in Sonora and brought the booty they didn't want to trade. They didn't want to trade with storekeepers in Chihuahua, and the Mexicans often tried to talk peace deals, get the Apaches drunk, as I've said, on mezcal, so they could easily slaughter them. And Geronimo and Woe suckered Juan Mata Ortiz, who was Joaquin Terraza's number two. Terraza was the man who led the Mexicans when they wiped out Victorio the attack on Juan Mata Ortiz was by a trap at a place called the Chocolate Pass.
So tell us more about Chocolate Pass then. What happened there?
Okay, Chocolate Pass there's a little mountain range that runs between Casas Grandes and a little Mexican town called Galena, and it was really a major thoroughfare. And the reason it was called Chocolate Pass was because of the color of the rocks around there, and the Chiricahuas had some bad interactions with Terrazas and Juan Mata Ortiz, and so they decided that they would ease down into the mountains close to where Juan Mata Ortiz had a ranch, which was near Galena. And the plan was to actually bait him to come out and go after a very few Apaches that he thought had stolen some of his horses. Well, as it turned out, the Apaches actually had to go into Galena and show themselves and take horses 3 times before Ortiz actually came out after them, furious, and they trapped him on the road into Chocolate Pass, between 2 groups. One was on horses, and one were in an arroyo running alongside the road. And as soon as Ortiz saw that he was being trapped, he took off. He led his men. He had 21 with him for a little rock-covered hill, and he got up on top of the hill, and his men furiously started setting up a little rock wall that they could fight from behind. Wow. And the Apaches showed up, and they had 2 or 3 sharpshooters keep the Mexicans pinned down, and they crawled up the hill pushing a stone in front of their heads as a shield.
Shield, yeah.
Right. Wow. And when they finally got up to that rock wall, they went over it, and it was hand-to-hand combat. But they wiped out all but 2. One kid got on a horse and took off, and Geronimo told the men to just let him go, that he would bring back more that they could kill. And the other one that had survived was Juan Mata Ortiz, and they dug a little pit, put brush in it, staked him out over it. And Nane, who was anxious to get a little revenge on him, because Nane was Victorio's number 2, and he had just escaped being wiped out because he was in the right place at the right time.
Wow.
And he set the brush on fire, and they literally burned him to death, but they thought that it was a good death because he didn't make a sound. So
what do you mean by that? Like it killed him quickly?
No, that he showed great courage and bravery in not letting them enjoy his suffering.
Wow. It was definitely a different time back then.
Yes, it was.
Very interesting story there, and again, one that a lot of us have never even heard. So you mentioned earlier that the Mexican government had a bounty on the Apache scalps, and I was just curious, did the Apache also do likewise?
No. The Apaches very rarely took scalps. And when they did, it was usually only in revenge or for some kind of rare ceremony that they had. There's a story about after Geronimo surrendered, all of this stuff about Apaches scalping people was in the newspapers, and some of the first reporters that he talked to asked him if he could show them his cloak that he had made out of human scalps, and Geronimo turned away from them. He thought they were crazy because Apaches just did not scalp. They didn't like to handle dead bodies. That was the bottom line.
Yeah, it made for sensational stories, I'm sure, in the papers, but again, so much misinformation out there.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Geronimo had an interesting and very strategic way he fought in battle. Why don't you share more about that?
Okay, this I think what you're referring to is the battle where Mangus Colorados, Woe, and Cochise led columns to Arizpe in Sonora, Mexico, to avenge what had happened to their people the year before, Llanos. Geronimo was given the honor of directing the warriors because he had lost his entire family, a wife, 3 children under 10, and his mother at Llanos. The battle was bows and arrows versus rifles. And the main reason the warriors didn't use rifles was the ammunition. They just didn't have an easily accessible supply. And so in those days, which was in 1851, while they had a rifle, they just didn't use them unless they really needed them for the range. And they could shoot bows much faster than cap and ball rifles and revolvers, and they could be that could be loaded in an up close fight. And so bows were actually superior to the rifle if you were close to your enemy. Where the rifle was superior was in range. It could accurately hit a target at a much longer range than a bow and arrow, at least 3 times the range that a bow and arrow might have.
Sure.
And unlike most of their battles, the Apaches didn't fight from ambush in this particular battle, but went nose to nose with the Mexicans in a pitched battle. No one knows how the Apaches knew Arispe was the location of the same military that killed their people the year before. And this is also the battle where Geronimo supposedly got his Mexican Anglo name, where that every time he led a charge, the Mexicans would call on Saint Jerome for help, and so the Mexicans called him Geronimo, which became anglicized to Geronimo.
Wow.
And that battle lasted about 2 hours. There were a lot of warriors that were killed, but there wasn't a Mexican left alive, and Geronimo was still standing.
And Geronimo was still standing.
Yep.
Wow. Wow. So what else can you tell us about Geronimo? I mean, obviously he's pretty, I don't know what the word is, sturdy. Let's just say warrior. So tell us more about Geronimo and the other warriors as they fought in battle. What else do you know?
Well, the first thing to take note of is that the Apaches were among the greatest athletes in the world at the time.
Wow.
They could run 80 to 100 miles in a day without stopping. And they probably maxed out day after day, doing about 70 miles a day for day after day running.
Wow.
It was rare, but not uncommon for them to run a horse into the ground if it was carrying a man. That kind of running probably didn't exceed 100 miles. And on horses, you know, we see these great paintings of Comanche cavalry leaning under the horse's neck and doing all sorts of tricks on them when they're fighting. But as far as an Apache was concerned, a horse was just a tool. On horses, Apaches were basically mounted infantry. When they got to a battle, they didn't fight from their horses. They got off to fight.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And, you know, they just weren't like most people seem to imagine that they were. They were ambush specialists, and they usually fought from cover. And for an Apache to be wounded in a fight, it was not considered a particularly good or brave action. And rarely did they use bait tactics like the Plains Indians did. And the Chocolate Pass fight happened in a pass between, as I've said, Casa Grandes and Galena, but it was really a very rare tactical thing that they did.
I had no idea. I mean, I can't imagine facing battle and then jumping off my horse and going straight into the ambush. It's just, wow. Interesting. So I know that we talked earlier about the Mexicans quite a bit, but Geronimo had an exceptional reason for hating the Mexicans. Why was that?
Yeah, this is the reason that they went to Arispe for that big battle. The Sonoran military sneaked into Chihuahua, found the Apache camp while the men were off trading in what was probably llanos. The Apaches called it Cascaye, and murdered nearly everyone in it, including Geronimo's family. And when he and the other men returned at the end of the day from a day of trading, they found the camp destroyed and the bodies of their families. And the trading trip had been led by Mangus Colorados. He didn't have the men or the weapons for immediate revenge and returned to Arizona to start preparing a major revenge raid the next year. And as I've said, they traveled into Mexico from three directions with Cochise and Huo leading the other two columns. And Geronimo was given the honor of leading the attack head on.
Mm. Wow. As he should.
Yep.
And you once told me that while Geronimo was grieving, he heard a voice. Tell me about that.
Yeah, he has told people that he felt like he'd been stunned for a long time, and a short time later he was sitting staring off into the distance, and he heard the voice of the great creator god of the Apaches, Usin. And Usin also spoke to him about 25 years later when he was praying for his sister, quote, quote. She was actually his cousin, who was the wife of Woe. And she was struggling to have her first child, Daklugi, in 1874. And the first time he heard the voice, it said, "No gun will ever kill you. I will take the bullets from the gun and I will guide your arrows." And the second time, 25 years later, he heard that to go back, he had climbed up a mountain while Ishtan was in labor, and had been praying there, and the voice said, "Go back. She and her first child will be safe, and you will not die from anything that happens to you in battle. You'll die in your bed." And that's the way it happened.
That is what happened. Wow. So he had these, what some would say are supernatural powers. He also was hearing the voices, and we'll get a little bit more into that side of Geronimo in a bit. So did he get to avenge his family?
He avenged his family for the rest of his life until he surrendered in 1886. And an example of this is in 1882, he led 70 warriors out of Mexico to force the Kahini chief Loco and his people, about 350 who were still at San Carlos after Geronimo and about half of the Chiricahuas had left the reservation, and they had been eminently successful in getting away from the Americans. And with 350 people, most of them women and children, they had gotten across the border where the Americans couldn't follow, with the loss of maybe one or two. Mm-hmm. So they went back to get Loco because they wanted his fighting men. And in 1882, they were out on a big plateau called Ash Flat that was above the San Carlos Reservation. And they ran into a sheep camp that was run by a man named Maestas. He was a young, strong and powerful Mexican, and Geronimo rode up to the camp with the men and scared the daylights out of everybody. And Maestas immediately recognized Geronimo because he had been a captive of the Apaches back when he was a child. And Geronimo had realized that he had just been taken when he was a little too old. He was about 12 years old when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so after a year or so, Geronimo traded him to a rancher for a pony, a revolver, and a box of shells. And when they came upon the camp run by Maestas, Geronimo asked him if they could have some sheep to eat, and Maestas had already been warned by one of the White Mountain Apaches who was helping him not to let Geronimo in camp. Well, he did, and sure enough, after they had a meal, Geronimo had his men tie all of the Mexicans together and kill them. And they did. Geronimo took Maestas's rifle. It's a new Winchester. Shot him in the private parts. And as Maestas was screaming in agony, then he put a bullet in his heart, killed him, and said, "See, I had mercy on you, Maestas." And Maestas had 3 children there, and they were all quite young. I think the oldest was maybe 6. And their mother had told them to run and hide, but the Apaches found them anyway and wanted to know and they asked Geronimo, should we kill the children too? And he said, yeah, they need to die just like my children did. And so they killed 2 of them, but they couldn't find the 3rd one for a little bit until they found him hiding under the dress of one of the Apache women who had been helping cook. And they pulled him out and wanted to know if Geronimo wanted to kill him. And he said, yeah, he needs to die. And Geronimo's chief, who was the youngest son of Cochise, said, no, you're not going to do that. And Geronimo's father-in-law, a man named Jellikinney, put the point of his spear up to him and said, if you do that, you're going to die. And so Geronimo thought discretion was the better part of valor and said, okay, Naiche says I shouldn't kill the child, and I always obey Naiche. But he was like that until he surrendered. If he had a chance to kill a Mexican, he killed him.
Wow. See, and that's interesting that, he listened to the leader, even though, he was still trying to avenge his family.
Yeah.
It's such a sad story all the way around. So how many years did Geronimo and the Apache go back and forth in battle with the Mexicans? It seems like it went on for a long time.
Yeah, the Apaches fought the Spanish and later Mexicans for more than 250 years.
Wow, really?
And as the story that I just told illustrates, he took pleasure in killing Mexicans, and in particular, Sonorans, from about 1851 to 1886. Following Mangus Coloradus, he led raids into Mexico beginning about 1837. So he fought the Mexicans for nearly 50 years.
Wow, interesting. And then, so in 1848, the Mexican-American War came to an end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then later the Gadsden Purchase, which was in 1854. And so what did this treaty and purchase entail?
Well, in Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico gave up New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and Colorado, parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, Wyoming. It was about 55% of their original territory.
Really?
Yeah. And then the Gadsden Purchase was used to buy land for the best route for the Southern Transcontinental Railroad and to resolve disputes after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Gadsden Purchase and Treaty agreed that the Americans would stop Indian raids into Mexico from the United States.
Okay. So, and then this ends the Mexican-American War. So now the U.S. owns territories that once belonged to the Apache. And then on top of that, in the 1850s, we now have a new discovery that has people encroaching even more.
Yeah, that was the Great Migration to the 1849 gold fields in California. Some that were headed for California peeled out of the pack to stay in Arizona and New Mexico and start farms and ranches, and naturally that's where the friction began between the Anglos and the Apaches.
Oh, wow. Yeah, big changes there. It's just encroachments from all over. So did this cause the Apache to fight back even more?
Well, for several years, surprisingly, the Apaches treated the Anglos as friends because they had defeated their longtime enemies in Mexico. But that relationship slowly went bad until 1861, when Cochise, a son-in-law of Mangus Colorados, was involved in the Cut the Tent affair that started a 10-year war with the Americans. And the Cut the Tent affair was when a shave-tail lieutenant was sent to get Cochise to show where a kidnapped boy who later was a big name in the Apache Wars, his name was Mickey Free, to hand him over. They wanted Geronimo to give him back. Cochise to give him back. And Cochise said, "Well, I don't know who you're talking about, and I didn't have anything to do with it. But if you'll give me a couple of days, I can find it." And Bascom stoutly refused and told the soldiers to put Cochise and the people that were with him under arrest. Cochise whipped out a knife, cut through the tent, took off, and that was the start of a major Apache war. Mangus Colorados was murdered in 1863 when he came in for peace talks with General West. General Carleton, who had led the California column from California across the Arizona and into New Mexico to fight the Confederates, but when they got there, all they found were a bunch of angry Indians. And Carleton got Kit Carson to be his field commander against the Mescalero Apaches and Navajos, and began establishing what amounted to a concentration camp at Bosque Redondo next to Fort Sumner on the Pecos River. And the fighting grew steadily worse. General Crook arrived in 1871 and decided to establish the Apache Scouts in the belief that it takes an Apache to catch an Apache. And I think that that's really a good analogy, analysis of the situation. About 40% of the time between 1872, when Cochise agreed to a reservation, and an agent who was his friend Tom Jeffords, in 1886, which obviously was about 14 or 15 years, when most of the renegade Chiricahuas surrendered, there had been peace. Around 1880, the White Mountain and the CBQ Apaches discovered the White Eyes were claiming more and more of their reservation land, and there was little they could do about it. And there was a CBQ Apache. I have a hard time with his name. I think it's Nak-I Del Kalini.
Okay.
The Apaches called him the Dreamer. Started having visions which said the great chiefs and the game would come back when the White Eyes went away. And he had a version of a ghost dance, and he had a lot of believers who even included Apache scouts.
Right.
And the San Carlos agent at the time, a man named Tiffany, feared the Dreamer would start a war and ordered the army to arrest him. The Dreamer surrendered to the army, but his people were angrily demanded that he be freed. A fight broke out and he was killed. And the army overreacted to the situation and sent far more troops to San Carlos than were necessary. And Geronimo and his followers were convinced the army was coming after them. They weren't, and left for the Sierra Madre.
Wow, what a story. Very interesting. And you've obviously done so much research over the years, and you wrote 3 books about Geronimo. And one of them is called The Iliad of Geronimo. So there's obviously the book we all read in college, Homer's Iliad. Why did you choose the title you did?
Well, the word Iliad means a long series of woes or trials or events. And as we all know, the Iliad is an epic poem said to have been told by Homer describing the 10-year Trojan War. And it was a clash of heroes and gods during the siege of the fortress Troy by the Greeks. The story of Geronimo's wars in the last 10 years before his surrender, and the way General Nelson Miles finally deceived him into surrendering in his Sierra Madre stronghold with false promises, I think is an epic story that often mirrors the rage, the battles, and the deception told in the Iliad. It's a true epic story that is uniquely American.
Yeah, for sure. That's very interesting. I would have never tied those two together, and that makes total sense. So you might as well tell us a little bit more about what this book entails and what years you're covering throughout this book.
Okay, it begins with the first and only time, and I emphasize only time, Geronimo was actually captured. All the other times he surrendered.
Right.
And for the military fighting him, there's a big difference between capture and surrender. Like the Trojans, the Apaches believed they were safe in their great fortress in Mexico, the Sierra Madre Mountains, where the Americans couldn't come uninvited into Mexico, nor could they find the Apache camps if they did. The Sierra Madre covers about 40,000 square miles, and it's some of the roughest country on the face of the earth. And over the 10 years of the story, there were many heroes on both sides. General Crook managed to beat the Apaches with their own people, get into their fortress in Mexico, and find their camps. Geronimo believed he could do that only because God helped him. And the American Trojan horse was the lies that General Miles, who replaced General Crook, told the Apaches.
Very interesting. See, everybody go get the book. It's you've written some very interesting about the research, but about the stories and the human side of all of this. It's not just facts and data like you'll find when you're trying to find information. So thanks for what you're doing there. So even though most people have heard the name Geronimo, I don't know that everyone knows about his being sentenced to hang. What was that about?
Yeah, here's where the meanings of capture and surrender come into play.
Right.
If an enemy was captured, then there were no terms of surrender. The Army could do with a prisoner as if it had captured an outlaw. If an enemy surrendered, then there were terms and agreements that the Army agreed to follow with its captive. The only time Geronimo was captured, as I've said, was in 1877 by John Clum, who was a San Carlos agent with 100 tribal policemen at Victorio's Ojo Caliente reservation. And he was able to catch Geronimo, or capture him, by a trick. And Geronimo never forgot it. Clum's orders from the Bureau of Indian Affairs were to capture Geronimo, turn him over to local Arizona authorities, who, after a perfunctory trial, would hang him. And Geronimo, he carried Geronimo to the San Carlos guardhouse from Ojo Caliente, and put him in there and told him he wouldn't have to be there long because the sheriff was coming to get him to hang him. And Geronimo waited for the Tucson sheriff to come get him and in that guardhouse, and carry him to Tucson, where the White Eyes could watch him dance on air while being hung by the neck from a rope. But it never happened.
Once again, it never happened. So, I mean, how did he escape?
Well, it's almost supernatural, the way that it happened. First, the sheriff never came. Nobody knows why, but he just never appeared. Right.
Huh.
Clum had been implementing something called the concentration policy out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where they were going to put as many Apaches as possible on San Carlos. And he had gone from being responsible for a few hundred Indians to he was starting to push several thousand. And when he got back to the San Carlos with Geronimo, he realized that he was really responsible for a lot more than what they were originally paying him for. And his Apache police were very effective. And so Clum offered to handle the Apache question in Arizona if the BIA and Army would increase his pay. And they refused. You know, they were kind of outraged that he wanted more money.
Yeah.
And so Clum quit in disgust and just left. The new agent, Lyman Hart, talked to Geronimo and believed he'd be peaceful, and he let him go out of the guardhouse where anywhere he wanted to go on the reservation. Geronimo's wife, a lady whose name was Chihashkish, and two children were staying in Chief Naiche's camp on the Gila River, and that's where he went. After he surrendered in September 1886, President Grover Cleveland wanted to turn Geronimo over to civilian authorities for hanging, because General Miles claimed that he had captured Geronimo. after about 6 weeks of investigation, and they could not get the truth out of Miles. They had a general where they had stopped the train that the Apaches were on in San Antonio, and they were keeping them there until they resolved what was going on. And finally, they independently questioned Geronimo and Naiche about how they had surrendered or were captured. They both told almost exactly the same tale, and so the War Department believed them. They didn't believe Miles, and they decided that, yeah, they had really surrendered, and so they would send them on to Florida rather than turning them back to the civilians who would surely hang them.
Wow. God.
So Geronimo escaped the hangman twice.